trustees. And on behalf of the staff and the board, I welcome you to Midland. I welcome you to the museum. It's my understanding that many of you have traveled quite a ways to be here. We're proud of our museum. We're proud of the story it tells about the development of the oil and gas industry in the Permian Museum. An integral part of that story is the Chaparral cars, the Chaparral exhibit. I'm sure most of you agree, as demonstrated by your presence and the distance that many of you traveled to be here. And with that, I'm going to turn this over to Luann, who will make the presentation here.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you. I'm so glad you guys are here. I know most of you have dealt with me and talked with me, and I just really wanted to say a personal thank you. I so enjoy and appreciate having the opportunity to visit with you guys. It really does make my job even more special and really fun. It makes it fun to come to work every day. So thank you for being here tonight. And so with that, we have a very special person here who's going to come and share with us some wonderful things. Come on up, Mr. Hall. Jim Hall.
Thank you, Luann, and thank you. We're really proud to be part of this museum. They're a great outfit. I think they really tell the Permian Basin story well, and we just fortunate enough to be a part of it and be recognized by them, and I feel honored to be here and talk about it. It's fun for me, and it's fun to have some people that enjoy it. So I didn't make up a speech to tell you. It's fun that we've got quite a few of the guys that worked at Chaparral back in the early days here tonight, and I want to point them out. Franz Weiss is here, and Wesley Sweet, and Harold Gafford is here for the first time, I think, and Joe. Come on, Joe. McAllister. Yeah, that Joe. Thank you. I apologize for stumbling on it, and I hadn't seen him in a long, long time. I think that's, and the Ney family is here. Don's gone, but of course his family's here, and that's very nice that they came. So, real proud to have all you guys here, and I will go back and say Mrs. Hall is here because Sandy Hall was an integral part of it. I'll tell how Sandy got involved in it. Number one, she got married to me, and when I came to Midland and opened my office out at Chaparral, I did. You want to?
I'm sorry, they didn't give me time to get you wired up.
Is this not working good?
This one's just for that camera guy.
Okay, all right.
And I apologize.
All right.
Real fast.
Have you got me now? Is that better? Okay. I didn't realize that. I thought I was hearing it. Okay. And I think you all got to see my son Jim earlier. He drove the car today, and here he is back with his wife Jen. And, he had instructions from Pop not to hit the curb, and he didn't. So he got an A+. That's a really wonderful thing about our exhibit here is these cars are living cars, and they're going to continue to live like they are real cars and run, and that's part of our deal. And they're not going to turn into a pile of dust in a corner that gets swept around every day because they're going to continue to run. And I think that's something that's important to me and important to everybody to see what was done here in Midland, and we're proud to be able to show it off. Okay, I was going to tell you how Sandy got involved in Chaparral. She came over one day she was an executive assistant to a guy in Dallas when I found her, and she came over to my office one day, and I'm not particularly clean desk man, and she walked into my office and said, looked around a little bit, and she said, would you like me to kind of figure out some files and separate this stuff into various categories and fix it up for you where it's a little easier to look at? And I said, yeah, that'd be nice. Well, that was her first day at work. She didn't leave since. So she was a major part of Chaparral the whole time in my life and in my life for most of it. And we don't want to forget her. So thanks for being here, hon. Yeah. If anybody has got a question about, I tell you, I ought to start talking to you about the Chevy car that's here, I think. For the first time in the exhibit, we now have a prototype Chevy prototype Corvette that was designed and built in the early 60s. I think they call it a 1964 GS2B. And the reason it's a B is kind of important. The way we got involved with Chevy is we met them up at Elkhart Lake when we were running a race there, and they had brought a show car there that was called a Monza Coupe, and it had a Corvair engine in it in the back, which was unusual for a Chevy, and it was a really good-looking little coupe. And I walked over and was looking at it, and the guy that had engineered it, a fellow named Jim Musser, was with it, and he was bragging about it being a semi-monocoque chassis. And I thought, wow, that's interesting. That's what we're building. And we were building our first Chaparral 2 here, the car that you saw run today. And we were building it with a so-called semi-monocoque chassis, and that means it's built kind of like an airplane. The skin is what makes the strength of the chassis. You don't have a chassis that's separate from that. You just have the skin, and it's put together in boxes in such a way that it makes the car strong enough and stiff enough. So you save the weight. You save quite a bit of weight. And race cars had not been built that way before. And when Hap and I started looking around at how to build a car, we made a trip out to both North America and in Los Angeles, and we saw Chance Vaught in Dallas, Fort Worth, and one other place. And we just kind of went in and looked at the construction methods that they were using during the early 50s to build high-performance military equipment. And we decided that we would use a composite structure, a fiberglass and epoxy structure to build our car. And so we had started that project, and it was all pretty well along when I went and saw this car in Elkhart Lake, and I said, gosh, that's interesting. We'll be building a car like that too, but we're doing it with composites. And the guy kind of woke up and said, well, gee, that's interesting. Maybe we ought to get to know each other. So I went down to see them in Detroit, and they decided they'd come see us here. And so Hap made a deal with them. I was going to go Formula One racing that year, and Hap made a deal with them that he would do an improvement to our track and make one of the pads into a skid pad if they would do some testing down here in Midland. So that was the deal. And they brought a car down here in '63. It was called GS2, and it was a future Corvette, but it looked much more like a Corvette, and it had a semi-monocoque steel chassis, and I tested that car here, and so they saw our car under construction, and they realized right away that theirs looked awfully big and more than you needed for a high-performance race car. And when they took that car back, and sure enough, about 6 or 8 months later, they wanted to come down and test a new car, and it was the B model. In other words, they went back and they more or less used the platform that we had used. In other words, the size, the shape, the basic layout of our car to build this GS2B. Well, it's here and has been here since the late 60s. they just left it. In other words, when they sent it down here, it was, and I finally got them to send me an invoice because it was here, and we were just storing it, and they sent me one, and the invoice said, material being shipped to Chaparral Cars in Midland, Texas, to be used for testing, not to be returned. And that's the way I got it. So anyway, we've kept it all this time, and I have to say that I probably I developed my whatever expertise I have as a test driver probably more in that car than any of our cars, because they had a mechanic and an engineer down here with it when they brought it down, and they wanted to try this and they wanted to try that, and so they'd try it, and of course we got, I mean, you wouldn't think so this spring, but we've usually got weather that you can go out and test almost any day through the winter even, and so they were down here in the winter when they couldn't test up there, and they'd work on the car, and they'd come knock on my door in the office and say, would you take it out for a couple of laps? We want to try this. Well, I'd go out and run it for 10 laps, bring it in, they'd write it all down, then they'd take it back in the garage and change something, and they'd come back and ask me to do it again. Well, I got to see all the changes they made and drove it every time they made a change, and I read the logbook, what they wrote in it. So over that period of time, say from 1964 up through 1965 for sure, about 2 years, I probably put in more laps out there on that track in that GS2B than I did in our own cars. And I got to see all those changes being made. So I attribute a lot to having the experience of driving that car. And I feel like it's a part of our history, because I used, whatever I learned, I used on our car. If I learned this or that about it, I thought, well, gee, we ought to be doing that too. So it was really a big part of it. So I just decided that it ought to be here with our cars as part of the legacy of our cars. I'm open to questions. If we got a microphone going around, anybody's got a question, well, I haven't made up a speech, so I'm happy to try to answer anybody's questions about what we did or why we did it. Right here.
I got one question. Was the GS2, was that the only chassis that they did?
No, actually, at that time they brought two of them. They brought one called Surf 2, which was developed by the Corvette people. Zora Duntov actually came with it, which was kind of interesting when he came down to Midland while we were tested here. And the other one was this GS2, and it was his car was a four-wheel drive car, but they were very similar. I think the body molds were probably the same, and the chassis were the same size. Both of them were steel, stress skin kind of chassis, and to do them out of steel, they made them really thin so they'd be light, and they were spot welded together. And it was kind of like when I was younger, that you probably don't say those things now, but whenever you saw a really flimsy tin can, you said like a Prince Albert can. And that's what I always thought about those cars. It's kind of like a Prince Albert can. Yeah.
Jim, did that, when you say GS, then was the Grand Sport Corvette after that?
No, the Grand Sport was before. In other words, the reason it's named GS2 is because they built GS1, or the Grand Sport. So it was apparently a prototype for a future Grand Sport.
So there were really only, of the Grand Sport, there were really just 5 of those made?
As far as I know, there was only 5 of them.
Right, okay.
Yeah. Yes?
After your Stardust accident, did you do any more testing at Rattlesnake? And was one of the pictures of the 2K I saw, it looked like it was being tested at Rattlesnake. Did y'all test the 2K there?
Yeah, we did. The track was built in probably 62, and by the time the 2K could have run on it, it had been resurfaced once, and the only reason it got resurfaced is because we had another IndyCar team in town. VDS decided that they would get involved in IndyCar racing, and they thought it would be handy to be able to test here, and we did too, but the track had really deteriorated a lot. And so the two of us went together and resurfaced it so that we could run out here. So the 2K did run out there, that's correct. Yes, sir.
What was it like as you developed your cars to watch the progress and the results? What was that like?
Well, it was, there's a lot of time pressure in what we do because it's all a limited amount of time that you're going to be able to perform on a racetrack somewhere, and you got to be there at that track on that date, and you can't write your boss a letter and say, hey, I need another week. You just do it. And so I guess the best way I can answer that for, it's kind of a step-by-step process. I mean, you have an idea, you try to do it, you try to learn everything you can about it, you try to even write the equations so that you know what forces you're dealing with, and then you make a theory, and then you try to go prove that. And that's the way you make progress at it, and we worked at it that way. And I know the guys that are here know that I was pretty specific about, well, we're going to write it all down in the logbook so that we got the record, and so that we can look back and see what we had last week or last month or last year. And that's the way we went at it. And the one thing that I can tell you that was so exciting to us, to me personally, was we built the first car, and we tested it on the track here, and we tried to learn if it was strong enough, if we had made any mistakes there. For instance, we nailed down some 2x4s out there, and we'd run across those 2x4s in the car, and then we'd run across them under the brakes, and we'd run across them turning, and to see what kind of, we put pretty major loads into the car just to see if we'd under-designed it. And we were, all this time we were still building the body because we were behind on body work, but we had the car running. And so I was driving it quite a bit around the track, and it was quite fast. And it was a good car. I liked it. It was easy to drive. Had it pretty well, what I'd say, tuned to the track so that it was handling most of the track well. And then we built the body. And we put it, or we had been building it, we put it on the car. And I took it out to drive, and it was awful. And we built this body based on some wind tunnel data that we'd gotten from GM, actually. So we thought we'd done a good job with the aerodynamics on it. Well, it wasn't a good job. It wasn't anything like we thought it was going to be. So then we decided we had to fix that. So I started measuring the aerodynamic forces on the car, and I did it in a couple of ways. One, I actually measured the pressure on the surface of the car so that we could see the pressure differences around on the car, and I did it in a very, today you would think in a very crude method. I've made a little manometer with 20 tubes in it, and we drilled 20 holes in the car and attached the tubes to the bottom of them, and then I'd go run it, and I'd hold it at a constant speed, and had a Polaroid camera sitting next to me, and when I got stabilized at 100 miles an hour, I'd push the button, and I'd get a picture of the 20 tubes, and then we'd drill 20 more holes, and we'd move it, and we'd do that again, and so we made a pretty good surface map of the car, but it took a little while. And that was the first time we did that. And then, the other interesting thing, I'd read in a book that when they first flew airplanes and they wanted to try to get airspeed, that they wanted static air pressure. And this guy, who was obviously pretty sharp, he said, well, I got static air pressure right here. So he put it in the thermos bottle, put his static tube, in the thermos bottle, and they go fly the airplane, and they do the same kind of thing. They're measuring pressures all over. And then he'd come back down and watch the manometer and open the thermos bottle, and if it still stayed the same, he said, well, I had static pressure the whole flight, so I knew what I was doing. Well, that's the way I started this thing. And then you look for a static pressure place. In other words, you find one, finally you find one on the car that stays static all the time, so then you got it and you know where it is, and you don't have to carry that thermos bottle anymore. But that wasn't my idea, it was somebody else's. I've read about it. I thought that was interesting.
Speaking of ideas, do you have any new ones? Or did you leave anything on the drawing board? Did you leave anything out there that didn't get developed?
Well, I'd like to finish his question. I'm going to say one. This is a long answer, but when we finally figured out that I put a car together that did not have any lift. In other words, basically, it was the same at 100 or 130 miles an hour that it was standing in the garage, and it wasn't a very nice car to drive. And so I thought to myself, you know, if I took all that lift off this car and made it where it's, you know, it's just the same as it is static, you know, I can push down on that car. If I can get rid of that much lift, I can push down on that car. And when I did something that made it go negative, the lap times went wonk, just like that. And that's the greatest moment that I had in racing, really, is when that happened. You asked me, how did I feel when we had, well, that particular thing was worth my whole career, really.
When was it?
That was at the beginning of 1964. We took the car to the first race at Riverside in 1963, qualified it on the pole, and I led the race for 7 laps, and then it shorted out the fuel pump. Had something happened, shorted out the fuel pump, and I was out of the race. So that was its debut. And after that short season in the fall races in 1963, I came back to Midland and I said, I got to cure this lift problem with this car, and I'm going to do it. And so I went through test after test after test, and we changed the shape of the whole nose, and I finally got it, like I said, where it just didn't have any lift. And I'd say probably in even February of 1964, that's when that happened to me, and that's what changed our whole position in racing, really, right then. And we were doing that. In other words, we were dealing with what I called downforce at that from then forward. So that was my real wake-up moment. Yeah, and somebody wanted to ask a question over here that I turned down.
Sorry, I thought you were looking at it. Did you leave any ideas on the drawing board? Do you have any new ones?
Well, no. You know, that's the easiest answer. I haven't been around racing for a long time. I worked really hard at it. These guys know, they all worked with me, worked harder than I did in a lot of cases. You know, we were a small team, and it was really a good team because we had instant feedback. Everybody knew whatever the other guy was doing, and we were, I think a lot of us were really committed to what we were doing, and we had a fantastic time, got an awful lot of work done. But it takes a lot of hard work and hard effort, and I did it for a lot of years myself, and I'm when I quit, I don't think about it anymore. I just don't, and I don't go to the races. I don't read about them. I've got other interests, and I really don't. You know, I haven't even really thought about it. When I look at the aerodynamics on these Formula One cars now today, I think, my God, is that really happening? I mean, I saw a picture of the Formula One front wing, or I think it was, I don't know whose car it was even, but it must have 30 different elements just on one front wing. And I think, my goodness, is it really worth all that? You know, and I guess it is. If I mean, they do it, but it's hard for us, for the guys that raced in the time we did, on the kind of budgets that we ran, to think that they spend more on that right front wing than we spent all year. You know, so Yes, sir.
How many engines would you use during a typical Can-Am season? And how did you manage them?
Oh, well,
Just as getting them refilled, whatever.
it was so variable for us that I don't have a really good answer. For instance, I think I had the best Can-Am car out there in 1967, except that I couldn't finish the race. And I made the decision personally to change from using the small block Chevy to using their new big block in 1967. It was all aluminum, and I got the offer from Chevrolet that they'd build engines, and so that took a load off of us, and I thought they could do a good job, and they were powerful, but they were unreliable. And I had 11 engine failures that year during less than 11 races, I'd say. Yeah, it didn't turn out good, and so that's a really hard one to. We weren't in the mode of the teams like they are now, where maybe they got 6 engines and they're all and they overhaul so often, and we just fixed them when they needed to fix them, and we knew about how long they'd run, so we overhauled them and put them back in the car. And we did that. We overhauled them and ran them and put them back in the car, so we knew pretty much we had the equipment to do. Ron's right here did a good deal of it for us, and he knew plenty how to do it, and we didn't. Before we got those engines, I'd say we had an excellent record. For instance, in the Formula 5000s that I ran after the Can-Am, where we ran a fairly simple car and used a small block Chevy, I think we had a very excellent engine program, and they were very reliable. Yeah. So those 2 years are kind of the opposites.
Okay, one more question, and then we're gonna wrap this up, okay?
Oh, they got more than that. We can hang
You
on.
wanna go a little
yeah,
longer?
Yeah, we can go a little longer.
Okay.
Somebody.
You went from Can-Am into Trans Am and then Indy cars. What piqued your interest to do those things?
Well, we didn't really. We went from Can-Am to endurance cars first. We ran the World Championship endurance cars during '66 and '67, and I think that was probably a part of our undoing, because we really took on more than we could handle. But it was fun to do, and we managed to win 2 of those races, the international championship races. The first one at the Nürburgring in 1966, which somebody told me then that was the first time an American car had won one of those races in 40 years. So that was kind of a nice accomplishment. And then we won one of the races the next year. Our car was not very reliable in either case, but we won one of them the next year too. So it was a worthwhile thing, but it was tough, and I think it spread our resources pretty heavily. The reason that we got involved in Trans Am was because we had almost a debacle year running in 1969 in the Can-Am, and we crashed the car at the end of the year, and it wasn't very good all year anyway, and they had banned wings, and so they came along and also had said that they weren't going to run big stock block engines in the international championship races anymore either. So that put us out of that racing. We couldn't use the technology that we had in the Can-Am any further, and I think the last thing is that Roger Penske quit running Chevrolets and went over to AMC, and John DeLorean called me and asked me if I'd take on the Trans Am for the next year. Well, we didn't have much going, so I said yes, and that's what we did. Long story. Yes, sir.
How many of you guys have Hot Wheels from the 2G? Yeah. When I was growing up, I'd get the big set. The Chaparral, McLaren, Lola, ran this huge set. Dad, pat me on the back, called the hotel, got the wings, sent it back. But fast forward to my last birthday, I told my brother-in-law the same story, and he bought me a new chaparral. Owned it from '69 with a wing, and he brought it to me at Pete over at Mr. Gaddison in Odessa, and he had this look on his face, just life was gone. I said, "What's going on?" He said, "I had the perfect gift, and I failed." He lost the wing. Twice I've lost the wing of the chaparral. His wife found it in the floorboard, so now my life is complete.
Yeah.
Could you tell us what kind of the rivalry or the competitive spirit between you and the other top Can-Am teams was like at the time?
With the rivalry with
McLaren or the other
McLaren,
top Can-Am
mostly with McLaren, really. Bruce and I were really good friends, by the way. When I got invited to drive Formula One in 1963 by BRP, I only really knew Bruce over there. So Sandy and I rented an apartment in Surbiton where Bruce lived, and lived over there for that season. And we palled around together and all over Europe, drove our cars to the races kind of together, and Sandy learned to drive in England that way because Patty got hurt in a ski boat accident that summer, and she was still having to go into that. In England, it's a little bit centralized, I'd say. She was going all the way to the main hospital in London for therapy. So Sandy drove her down there twice a week for the first month we were in England. So she learned how to drive on the left side before I did, really. But we had a really fun relationship because we felt like we were the top competitors in that series for even the pre-series and then the Can-Am series. And Bruce and I could go out and race as hard as we could against each other, and then come in and go to dinner and talk about it, and say, well, your car wasn't so good there either, and that kind of a relationship with him. And that was a great relationship for us. And I think that's something that people have asked me about, and I'm going to expand on that a little about racing. And I think a lot of the sports around the world and in the country, we felt like it was a sport, and our competitors were our friends, and you did everything you could not to damage them in any way or touch their car on the racetrack or whatever. And as the money kept coming into the sport, as television coverage grew and the sponsorship grew and so forth, it becomes more like an entertainment business than a sport. And I think that's happened a lot to our sports in this country. And it has to do with how much money's coming in and how important that sponsorship is to to finishing well. You become protective of everything that you have, and the guys aren't friends with each other anymore, and they'll knock the other guy off just to get a position in front of him, and they got a spare car. I mean, we didn't really have a spare car. We had a spare parts, and sometimes we had a spare car, but we didn't have two cars that were identical. I mean, you couldn't jump from one car to the other and expect to go the same. So these guys have got a car that's identical to the one they're sitting in, and if they tear it up, they just jump in the other one and go. So I think that the sport has changed a good deal from the way it was when I was involved in it. Yes, sir.
The 2C had kind of a short lifespan. Did you already see the writing on the wall for the 2E wing version, or was it just kind of a troublesome?
I think you found a failing in Mr. Hall's way of doing business. The 2C was a quite good car. It was actually very, very capable. But I already had the idea for the 2E, and I really wanted to build it. And that's the way we used to do it. you know, it's amazing what we could get done. We had a fall racing series that lasted through October, basically, and then we didn't start racing again until, I've forgotten when, June or something like that. And we build the cars in the winter, and then we go race them in the other half of the year. And we didn't have two teams. We didn't have a team that built them and another team that went racing or anything like that. That's the way we did it. So, if hindsight, if we had run the 2C in 1966 in the Can-Am instead of trying to get the 2E ready to go, we'd have been a lot more successful, like I said, in winning races. I think, you know, I have probably my own personal desire was to try to build the best machine that I could build in any way, and I had the ideas and I was ready to go, and so we went for it. Yeah. Let me take one more.
Tell us again about the rain in 1965 at Sebring. That story. You said something that, was it Hap that raced with you?
Hap?
Who raced with you?
Hap did, yeah.
He went to get in the car, you were pushing him back, saying, wait a minute, I gotta tell you something about the rain and the water.
That's a good story. Hap and I were actually equal partners in Chaparral, and Hap was a really good partner and a good driver and a good guy, and had a lot of good input to it. So you never have to leave him out of any of these stories. But we were co-driving at Sebring, and our car was fantastic, and we just decided that the thing to do was keep right on going. And we weren't using it too hard. We weren't doing anything to tear it up. So we just kept right on going. Well, it turns out at 5 o'clock, huge thunderstorm, or 4 o'clock, whatever it was, and we were 2 laps ahead. And so I was in the car, and it started raining really hard, like it does here when we get a big thunderstorm sometimes. And by the time I got back to the pits, the puddles were deep enough that it was really, I had to go real slow just to get back to the pits. And our car, you couldn't push start it because it had a torque converter between the wheels and the engine, so it wasn't a push startable car. It had to start with a battery. And so I stopped at the pits, and we watched the rain for a little while, and the lap times dropped from, we were running out 3 minutes and something, down to over 25 minutes for a lap. And so I said, Hap, we can sit here for an hour. And he, we paced around. It was his turn to get in, and he said, I'll just take it real easy. I'll just go easy. If we make only one lap, And I said, okay, but don't stall it. So he got in it and did that. He went out and he ran very slowly, and the water was so deep that our radiator inlet's right on the bottom of the front of that car. And the water was coming in, going through the radiator, up over the hood, over the windshield, and into the car. And it filled the whole cockpit up, right up to the where it runs out the doors. And that's how deep the water was. And I'll be darned if it didn't keep running. I mean, it kept running. And of course, it weighs a lot, so it's not going to slide around much. And he made a lap, and then another lap, and then another lap, and then the wind, and then the rain kind of slashed off. And from the Shelby pit up front of us, tires, when they changed the tires, the wheels floated down by us. In any case, it was an amazing race. So when he came in, it was starting to get dark. And the visibility wasn't very good, and of course the water had receded an awful lot, and he'd only been in the car about an hour. And he came in and started to get out of the car, and I said, hey, wait a minute. I said, you know where the puddles are. Yeah, can you drive another stint? And he looked at me, and his eyes got about that big, And I'll be darned if he didn't just, he just sat right back down and took her back out again. And I just amazed that he was able to do that. I bet he was cold, for number one. But he did it, and he did a great job. I got to finish the race. He came in again after another hour, and then I drove it to the finish. But it was pretty dry by the time I drove it. And,
Did you have to bail it out? Did you have to bail it out when it filled up with water?
I don't get the question. I'm sorry.
Did you have to bail out?
Well, no, it would run out somewhere, but when you were running, when you were out running, when you were running, it was actually coming in fast enough to fill up right to the doors. And we weren't going very fast,
How much time did you win the race by? Do you remember?
Oh, a bunch. 4 laps.
4 laps.
Yeah. Yeah, you were going to ask. Well, I'll take one more.
Well, I talked to you about this earlier, especially when you were in Europe racing the long distance races. It was very inspirational to a lot of us in America, what you were doing. But your cars and the technology were very good, but they were aesthetically so beautiful. Yeah. And I always wondered, did you put time into the aesthetics of the car, or they just come out looking so beautiful?
That's question's been asked a lot, and the answer is we did not. If you look at the very first one, it's a bit of an ugly duckling in my opinion, and that's the car we drove today. As it became developed, and we added things to it, it actually became better looking. And we weren't looking for that. We were just trying to do the effective thing. My position is, you don't make it look for some way just because you want it to look that way. You make it look that way so it does something. And particularly, I remember the H car, which was really unsuccessful. 2 designers, world-class designers, had come up to me at the various times and said, "How in the world did you get the shape of that car? It's got this shape and it's got that shape." And I looked at them and I thought, well, why would it be any other way? I mean, but they particularly wondered if you looked at the cross section. The car came up and around the tires and then back down a little bit, and then that curve went all the way from the front to the back, and front to back real smooth. And one of them was a guy was the head designer at Porsche, and the other one was Ed Welburn from GM. And they said, "We just think that's a fab." And you know what that is? It's the shape of the tire when it goes up into bump. In other words, when that tire goes up into the bump, you cover it with a shape that's shaped around the outside of the car, across the tread, and then back down the other side. And that's all it was. It was the shape of the tire. That has to be that shape. There's no other shape to make it, really, if you're trying to cover it with minimum material. And so that was the front tire shape when it was in bump, and then the rear tire shape, and I just connected them. And that was it. So, well, thank you, guys. I appreciate it.